I think Senator Risch really got us going, didn't he, when he said there are new eras arriving. And he started us off by saying that one of the things that differentiates this era from the one we're leaving behind, and I loved his words, there are a bunch of no-goodniks that have come together in an alliance that were not there even a decade ago. I think all of us, in a sense, there's a consensus that the end of history is over. There is an end to the end of history. We've left that knife tape behind, frankly. And our leaders, military leaders, political leaders, are not only thinking about the no-goodniks, but they are thinking, as our video showed, about the challenges to liberalism and democracy from populist movements that are arising in your country, Admiral Bauer, and across the democratic world. That some of our liberal international students, he talked about the UN as well, are in decline, if not in decay, when we look back. The civilians, and we're going to talk about that on this panel, civilians are now at the center of the battle space, and that is a challenge for all of us. Climate change, which senators, and you talked about, Peter, is accelerating. And we have new domains of conflict, not only land, air, sea, but cyber, space, which are increasingly important when we think about the future. So our panel is going to focus on the role of the changing battle space, the kind of shape-shifting forces which are challenging us to think hard about what the battle space will look like, how it is evolving, and frankly, what we have learned from Ukraine in these really, really tough 1,000 days. So it's a pleasure to welcome all the panelists. At the end, and you're going to forgive me if I use your nickname because it's so good, General Chance Saltzman, Chief of Space Operations, so from here on in you're Salty. Mohammed Abulahoum from Yemen, the Chairman of the Justice and Building Party. And next to Mohammed is Dr. Cochav Elkayam-Levy, who has worked with the women who experienced rape, and frankly, as a war crime on October the 7th. And next to me is Admiral Bauer, a great friend of the Halifax Security Forum, a champion of the Women for Peace Fellowship Program, and oh, by the way, coincidentally, has led NATO for the last 5 years. Admiral Bauer, let me start with you. You have been so close to the evolving battle space in Ukraine. This is an old war and a very new war. Civilians have borne the brunt of this war, certainly in Ukraine. How do you think about the most fundamental challenges to the shape of the battlefield? What do you see coming forward?
I think it's important to notice, and Peter talked about the war that is ongoing now, approaching its third year, but actually, we're not talking about 1,000 days. We're actually talking about almost 4,000 days that this war is ongoing.
Yeah.
Because it started in 2014.
Yeah.
And I think in the military, in NATO, the thinking about what we needed to do started after the annexation of Crimea. So the whole thinking back to collective defense was the result of the annexation of Crimea. And so this huge shift in thinking in the alliance, back from going away from crisis response operations back to the core business, basically, of collective defense started in 2018, 2019. And that has resulted in all these strategies and plans and the things that have been agreed by all the leaders in the different summits. So that is one. I think it is important to note, to basically understand where this all started. It was because of the Russians, because of the Russian actions in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Crimea, in 2022 in the whole of Ukraine. It was not NATO started this war, all this nonsense that you hear. If the Russians were really afraid of NATO, they would have responded completely different to the annexation, to the accession of Finland to the alliance. With a border of about 900 miles, they didn't send one soldier to the border with Finland. So NATO is not a threat to the Russians, and they know it. So this is about the fear of democracy. This is about them fearing democracy. Because if the people in Ukraine are able to control their government, to make sure that people can live the life they want to live, then the people in Russia might crave that too. That is the reason. And so I think for all of us, there's much more at stake than just Ukraine. It's important enough to fight for Ukraine, don't get me wrong. But there is much more at stake. This is about the rules-based international order, which was set up after 2 devastating world wars, where all of us, including China and Russia, said, this never again. That's why we have that rules-based international order. It's not an American system. It's not for nothing that the Chinese and the Russians are a permanent member in the UN Security Council, because they were part of setting up the system. So I think in many ways what we see is that, and there is a danger, I think, that we actually might see that the one rules-based international order that we have might split up in 2, where we have our part of the world in the present set of rules, and another part, and it might be BRICS or something, that is setting up another set of rules.
Do you already see that happening?
I think it is happening. I think it is moving in that direction. I think they're not successful yet, because, and the narrative of BRICS, I think, is that basically 1 billion people, which is what we defend in NATO, is owing half the economy in the world and half the military might in the world. And the other 7 billion have to divvy up the other half. And that's not fair. So I think that is sort of the narrative. It's a strange construct, BRICS, because India and China hate each other, but they're both in BRICS. So what is it? But I think there is an attempt to sort of group together other nations to make sure there is a counterweight to what we do. I think they're not that successful, because what we have in NATO is an amazing thing on the political and the military level. On a daily basis, we discuss everything with each other. And there's no organization in the world to be found like that.
I'm coming back to you about the civilians. And, you know, again, the civilians have frankly been on the front line in Ukraine, and the damage to the civilian infrastructure in Ukraine is something that we don't talk about. But if you look at the winter that's coming, and the destruction of the energy infrastructure, this is a battle space that is not only along the front lines. So how we begin to think about that. But Cochav, your work is directly related to this. On October the 7th, there was an attack across the border in which women were a principal target, and we had probably the most concentrated period of rape, which was used as a weapon of war. Tell us how the work that you're doing, which is both identification of the women, recording their testimonies, and this, by the way, entirely civilian, as a result of a civilian commission of inquiry. So it is civil society. How does your work lead you to think about where the lines of the battle space are?
Yes. So thank you so much. First of all, what an honor to be here with you, and to have the opportunity to share with you what we've seen during the past year and a half. So actually, I want to start by anchoring myself before October 7. I'm an international law professor. I teach international law, women's rights, feminist theory, and I've been very involved with a women's protest movement in Israel. And we found ourselves on October 7th quite shocked from the horrific crimes and brutality that was inflicted against civilians, against women and children, entire families that were taken into Gaza. And the first thing that we did is turning to the UN and turning to international organizations to stand with us, to condemn the crimes, to respond to what we've seen. And when we understood that there was no response, we started documenting these crimes ourselves. We started documenting the crimes against women and children, and documenting the horrific sexual abuse that was inflicted on women. But what was very concerning is that when we started documenting what happened to both women and children, we started identifying a new pattern. We started identifying the abuse of families, the fact that the terrorists invaded houses, entered houses. We started seeing time and again videos that the terrorists took themselves of them entering the houses, destroying everything inside, the faces of the parents, of the siblings, terrified. Sometimes minutes after they just saw the murder of their family members. And then we understood that we're seeing really a new crime against humanity. We started to understand that, I called international colleagues around the world and I asked them, have you heard of this? Have you heard of the weaponization of families? Have you heard about the abuse of families done as a weapon of war and as a strategy of war? And when we understood this has not been conceptualized, thanks to the help of Professor Erwin Kotler, we started documenting these crimes and understanding that it has to be defined. And talking about new eras, we defined it as a kinocide, kin as in familial relationships, side as in the systematic weaponization of families. And I want to explain something, perhaps just as a last sentence. When we started seeing the abuse of families, I thought I've seen the worst. But really, if there is hell, this is how it looks like. Someone abusing your kins, someone killing your loved ones in front of your house, in front of your eyes. And this is something we all have to fight. We all have to fight.
We're going to come back to that again because I think that's a theme that is going to run across all four about the centrality of civilians now, even when it looks like there's a front line around which the militaries organize themselves. Mohammed, you are in Yemen, where you've seen up close how a relatively small group have organized and been able to adapt the use of weapons to, in fact, the Houthis to control choke points, critical maritime choke points in the Middle East. How does this happen? And as we're thinking about weaponization of new kinds of forces, how do you stop that from happening?
Thank you very much. I'll just touch on this. Nobody does approve or sees this as an act of, is accepted what's happening in the sea. It's something that we all denounce. But let me look at the bigger picture and then come back. War is miserable. War is a catastrophe everywhere. And I'll just repeat what Peter said. The division, dark, and danger, and violence, and everything else. We've been witnessing it in the region. For the last 75 years plus, we've been in this dark tunnel. And we continue to insist to stay in this dark tunnel. Nobody's going to win. So what happens in Yemen, or what happens in Iraq, or what happens, it involves everybody in the region. So what we need right now is to seriously think and look to the future. We need peace in that region. Out of misery that's been happening right now, and the numbers, whether in October, whether in Gaza, whether everywhere else, nobody is with the violence anymore. We are sick and tired of this violence. So how can we look forward 25? I hope that 25 will move us forward and let us move from this dark tunnel. I am optimistic that we will reach somewhere, especially, and I hope this the new administration, if they continue in the direction of ending the war, let's just end the war, take a pause, and then start a serious dialogue, and I'm sure we will reach somewhere. And the key to many of the problems is that a serious dialogue has to be conducted, and I hope the international community and the US and many of the internationals will help the Palestinians and the Israelis to get a deal done. Once they get this deal done, everybody else in the region will file in, and no more excuses. The area has had enough, and if we don't get this opportunity, what is the alternative? The alternative is another 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 60, 80 years. I think the area cannot afford. So this is where I hope that the 2025 will be the beginning of the serious step to see peace in that region, and I hope we are in that direction.
You know, I think, Mohammed, you make a really, really important point, and they're related to one, violence radicalizes. And it's more difficult sometimes after intense violence of the kind that you've described to actually think yourself out and move to some sort of dialogue. But I was chatting with Senator Shaheen just as we were getting ready, and there is an opportunity in the phrase "end the fighting." There is an opportunity if the members of the region can seize it and use it and shape the future differently. General Saltzman, you work in Space Command and have spoken eloquently about the importance of space and how the security of all the NATO members and Canadians are actually very attentive to space and to how important it will be, how it functions in a sense as a new platform for communication, both military and civilian. How do you see, is space in fact now part of the evolving battlefield in the new era? And how do we actually, I'm going to ask you this question because I know you think hard about it and it's come up throughout the day. How do we work with the innovators in the private sector in a more constructive and frankly speedy way? I know that's something that our minister thinks about all the time. How do we build those bridges so that we can do better than we've done?
Well, thank you. First, let me just say it's so delightful to be back in Canada. The people are so nice. The weather is so
warm.
Predictable. If I can get my hands on a beaver tail, this is going to be the greatest weekend. This is terrific. United States Space Force was established because so much has changed relative to the security of the space domain. But I think it starts with a critical understanding of how important space has become. And I'm a little bit intimidated, I have to tell you. This panel is dealing every day with very tangible, tactile challenges, atrocities. The dangers that they're addressing are I want to say they're easy to see. We see videos, we see reporters telling us about it in anecdotes that are heart-wrenching. The dangers in space are a lot more invisible. And what I'm trying to do is make sure that we don't think of things so as being so far-fetched, so far out of mind, out of sight, out of mind, that we don't pay attention to the criticality of it. I'm a little worried that, like power lines, cell towers, they almost become invisible in the landscape. They're so ubiquitous, we understand what they do, that we quit paying attention to them. And I think to some degree space could be like that. 40% of agriculture depends on data gathered from space, worldwide. My dad tells me, go ahead.
GPS.
Yeah, my dad tells me all the time, hey, I'm not worried about GPS. As long as my phone tells me where to go, I can get to the store. I don't know what the big deal is. And my mom says, I don't even go to the store. I just need my phone to get on Amazon and have them deliver directly to me. And I tell them, that's all Space Force, you're welcome. And they're slowly coming along. But this is the kind of thing we have to make sure people understand is the criticality of space capabilities to our way of life, not just our national security, our collective national security. It's just becoming more and more critical. So once you understand how critical it is, you should recognize that our adversaries have recognized how critical it is and potentially how vulnerable it is. They've invested heavily in the ability to deny us those advantages that we gain from space capabilities. And I'm convinced that if the Space Force can't protect its space capabilities, and like militaries can't protect their space capabilities, we're going to struggle to meet military objectives. And I know people like Admiral Paparo understand in detail that if I can't deny an adversary the use of space-enabled targeting against our force, then we're also not going to be able to meet our security objectives. And that's what the Space Force is focused on. And yes, I think it's critical.
Say a little more, Salty, about how we work with innovators, because most of the advances in space technology are now occurring in the private sector. And that's new for militaries. That's a 15 or 20-year-old phenomenon, and it's challenging, frankly. How can we improve this process?
I've been involved in military space, taking advantage of the industry for more than 30 years now. So it is changing, but it's not new. What is really changing is the pace. If I wait 2 years to get funding, and I spend 3 years writing a requirement and developing the right contract vehicles, by the time I start buying that thing which was innovative, it is overcome by the next technology. So I think the most important thing is to think not about resources and scale, it's to think about the time component. If we are not agile in our ability to use resources, to put them on contract and take advantage of what industry is doing on a very rapid scale, then we miss this huge opportunity.
I would never dare to speak on behalf of our minister, but I am telling you, the minister agrees with you. We have to do something. We have to be quicker and more nimble and more flexible. Are there mics in the room? Because I see we only have about 10 minutes. And if you put your hand up, the mic will come to you. Please ask a question rather than make a statement, and just tell us who you are. A one-sentence limit on the question. Where are the mics? Come on down. Okay. Right here there we go. A one-sentence question, and just tell us which panelist you would like to answer the question.
I'm Admiral Samuel Papar, the Commander of the United States Indo-PACOM. And I didn't have a question, but I will gladly make one up quickly.
You do now.
Rob Bauer, please tell us, for all of the group, how can all of us here in the room be most helpful in advocating for what can be most helpful to Ukraine, to our nations? Because 2025 is so, as we approach 2025, it's going to be so critical this year.
Great
Thank
question.
You, Rob.
What's the best thing we can do? How can we be more effective?
A number of things is don't give up hope, and that was, Peter's point as well. There is hope. I mean, if there's anyone in the world, in the universe, to be able to do this, to crack this nut, it's us. So we have the money, we have the talent, we can do it. However, we don't have the focus yet. There's still not enough focus when it comes to the defense production. We were 2.5 years into the war. There is more money available, more serious money, more money available in the different ministries of defense. But the chiefs of defense tell me I'm unable to buy anything. Or I hear in 2035 your missile will be delivered. And that's not good enough. So what we see is that prices go up and the delivery times go to the right. Therefore, we pay more for the same, which is not good either. And secondly, we don't get the stuff we need for collective defense. And thirdly, we cannot continue to support Ukraine at the pace that is necessary, because we have started to give away weapon systems and ammunition from our own stocks. And that was good because it was necessary. But we didn't start giving away from full warehouses. We started to give away from half-full warehouses, or even worse. So the bottom of the barrel is visible in many nations. And that might not be the absolute bottom of the barrel, but it is sort of the bottom of the barrel where we're reaching the point of strategic reserve stocks, where you don't want to go under, because you need it also to defend yourself. And therefore, we need the industry to actually produce the stuff that we can then give to Ukraine. And the Russians have changed their economy to a wartime economy. The Russians now have friends. I mean, if North Korea is your best friend, you're not in a good place. However, the most isolated country in the world has now suddenly become a player, which is not only because of Russia, but also because of China, because they have allowed it to happen. And so, and that means that for Ukraine, they have not only given artillery, grenades, and missiles to the Russians, but now troops. Therefore, North Korea is part of the war of Russia and Ukraine. They are. There's another nation entering that war. That's a big thing.
It's the internationalization of the conflict.
And therefore, we now see a connection between the European theater and the Indo-Pacific because of that. So if people say NATO should not be involved in the Indo-Pacific,
Yes.
or the other way around, actually North Korea is the proof that it is necessary to talk about this. And if you want to solve the war, if you want to come to peace in Ukraine, it's not enough. First and foremost, I cannot imagine it is in the interest of the United States that Putin comes out of any possible peace negotiations as the winner. I cannot imagine that that is in the interest of the United States. Secondly, you do not only have to talk to Russia now, but you also have to deal with North Korea. The North Koreans get technology and weapon systems and ammunition from the Russians as well. So this is also a threat for the US in another theater, Sam's theater, where now suddenly the Russian weapons show up in North Korea. So I mean, this is connecting the world in a way that we didn't think was possible. And so, and it is connected to China. China is not, at least until now, truly giving weapon systems, but it is giving everything to the Russians with which they make weapons. China keeps Russia in the fight. Without China, Russia would not be able to continue the war. China talks about, the importance of sovereignty and the internationally recognized borders, and it's all good what you hear, but they have still not condemned Russia for invading a sovereign state with internationally recognized borders. They have chosen the other side when I talk about these two systems. They want a set of rules, but no longer the present set of rules. And that's fine, but then you have to change the rules in accordance with the rules. And they don't do that. So there's a lot of nations that watch this war, and the autocracies look at us, who's going to flinch first? And that is a very serious situation. So not supporting Ukraine is not only to the detriment of Ukraine, but is also dangerous for us. And people have to understand that this war is about much more than Ukraine.
Could we have a mic for Nancy Southern, who's sitting in the front row? I just want to underline what Admiral Bauer said while we're waiting for the mic. The stockpiles are very low. They are very low. We are close to the critical edge. And we don't talk about that enough, I think.
I think artillery is getting better slowly, but it's especially the air defense that is the big challenge. I think.
Yeah. Nancy.
Thank you. Nancy Southern, Chair and CEO of ATCO. Thank you very much, panelists and Dr. Stein. It's a great panel. Supply chain has come up on several occasions in several meetings over the past year. And in fact, 5 years ago, when Admiral Bauer was here, talked about supply chain and the availability of equipment, whether it's for space or whether it's on the field, battlefield, and whether it's support personnel. my question to you, if we are looking at the serious situation that you've just described, when we talked about World War II, manufacturers in all of the democracies in the Western world fighting the front were able to mobilize their manufacturing and deliver supplies, whether it was munitions, whether it was tanks, whether it was gear for our military efforts, ships. If it takes 5 years to actually negotiate and start a contract, as you've pointed out, we're hooped. And we're ready. We are in the manufacturing business, Boeing, ourselves. We're ready to mobilize. There is lots of money. Not a penny's being spent. So how do we get government, defense, and industry to start collaborating on how we actually streamline the process of procurement?
Something. I think that's one of the biggest issues we face, frankly.
There's no easy answer. Certainly, I'm not going to give you the answer to that question in a couple minutes. Maybe the first step is recognizing the depth of the problem and making sure that people that are in a position to change policies, change regulations, control the funds, not put the U.S. in a continuing resolution, for example, where it's hard to let the contracts. There's a lot of things that can be done, I think, if you look in and truly acknowledge that the problem exists and that it could be crippling when we have to really accelerate the capacities. I have seen, on the positive side of this, I have seen a more proactive approach to this. In the old days, I remember saying, well, you know there's a supply chain problem when you suddenly have a delay to the program. And then you start going backwards to figure out where the problem existed. There's a lot more work being done to try to be more transparent and understand what the supply chain is as you go into production. It's not as far along as it should be, but I think there's some level of proactivity. But it's about us scrubbing the policies, regulations, and the way we do resourcing, those procedures, with that in mind, knowing that we're going to have to scale faster than 5 years to be effective.
Admiral Bauer wants
Yeah, I think it's a mutual chokehold, what happens. It's the government dealing in the old ways. It's the industry dealing with it in the old ways. Too much focus on efficiency, not enough focus on effectiveness. I mean, COVID is a good example. We all agreed that was a crisis that needed to be solved quickly, and it was actually done. If you look at how the vaccine was produced, it is amazing. A lot of money was put on the table by the governments, and the industry did what they had to do. I think we can have the same result if you look in what happens in Ukraine or in Israel when it comes to, innovation and how quick it gets to the battlefield, and how procedures are skipped, and how, I mean, for us it's committees, and it is, is the safety, is the safety there, is everybody happy? No, I mean, if in Israel something is invented tonight, it will be used tomorrow morning if they're convinced it will help them. And the same in Ukraine. But for us, it's still like, we have our own problems, and it's somewhere else, and it's not really our problem. And it is our problem. And we can solve it. Honestly, I think we can solve it. But we need to focus, and we need to, to make sure that we get all the energy in the right place to solve it. We can solve it. If Ukraine can solve these things on their own, we can solve it as well. But we have to agree it is a crisis.
One of the advantages of having Admiral Bauer with us 5 years running is you hear the rising frustration in his voice.
And I want to add something. I think one of the main things that I realized watching those videos, really hundreds of videos, is that perhaps for me it's horrific, but for them it's inspiring. And they use the social media so widely in ways that, as you said, the threats are spreading so quickly. So I think if we won't respond to these innovative ways of war, we will just we'll find ourselves in a big problem.
And it is about a sense of urgency. We are out of time, and I'm standing, and I see 3 hands, and I can't because I'm standing between everybody and coffee, but come up right after, and we'll answer your question. But here's one last one for Admiral Bauer, because he has been such a supporter for women, right, ever since he became a regular attender at the forum. Should women be in combat roles, and what can we do about it to make it happen?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. I mean, honestly, if we're not willing to use half the population for a cause that is so important, then we're stupid.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more. Thank you to all of our panelists, to you, Mohammed, to you, Cochav, to Salty, and to Rob Bauer. You got us off to a great start this afternoon.